So thank you very much for the invitation to speak here this afternoon. The Center for Security Policy performs an invaluable service in its clear articulation of current and future national security challenges. I'm delighted to participate here because the issues are profoundly important and in recent years distressingly confounded by some in the political party whose claim to governance since World War II has rested importantly on a vision of energetic U.S. international leadership. But misunderstandings have a long and border-transcending history. At a dinner one night at Osborne House on the Isle of Wight, not far from Portsmouth, the center of the Royal Navy, Queen Victoria entertained a famous admiral who had a hearing problem. The Queen asked the admiral polite questions about the fleet and then changed the conversation and asked about the admiral's sister, whom she knew. Some of you know this. The admiral didn't understand. He thought that the Queen had asked about his flagship. "Well, ma'am," he said, "as soon as I get back to Portsmouth, I'm going to have her hauled out, rolled on her side, and have the barnacles scraped off her bottom." The Queen, however, realized that the admiral had misheard. So the dinner guests had a good laugh. There's less to laugh about in President Obama's graduation speech at West Point that was delivered earlier this week. He said that the most direct threat to America at home and abroad remains terrorism, but a strategy, he continued, that involves invading every country that harbors terrorist networks is naive and unsustainable. The main reason to dismiss this railing against his predecessor is not that al-Qaeda executed several major terrorist attacks during Bush's presidency in Istanbul and Pakistan, for example, which did not cause the administration so much as to consider invasion. The more important fact is that no one argues that the United States should invade every country that harbors terrorist network. This is not, as some in the media have claimed, a straw man. It is a burnt straw man. It's a little mound of ashes in a room that no one enters. The President follows public opinion in raising up terrorism as the threat to the United States. The result is a proportional diminution of the idea of American international leadership. What makes us exceptional, said the President, is not our ability to flout international norms and the rule of law. To whom I ask rhetorically, to whom is this astonishing argument addressed, except those he wishes to convince that American inaction in the face of crises has been and will in the future be repeatedly absolved by a lack of international consent. Thus, Mr. Obama's attempt to burnish his administration's foreign policy record. Those, he said, who suggest that America is in decline or has seen its global leadership slip away are either misreading history, again his quote, or engaged in partisan politics. Now, I travel to Europe, sometimes Asia, certainly speak with visitors from both often. They ask if the United States has lost interest in providing leadership to preserve such order as exists in the world today. They inquire about the effectiveness of the Obama administration's reset with Russia, about the crossed red line in Syria, about irresolute policy in Ukraine, about Iran's progress toward status as a nuclear power, about the claim that bin Laden's death had eliminated rather than metastasized Islamist terrorism, about the $1.2 trillion budget cut that this administration is on track to achieve before it leaves office. So, are my foreign interlocutors engaged in partisan politics when they ask these questions? If they are misreading history, as the President suggests, what is their error? They also ask about the current administration's rebalance to Asia. Is it real? They want to know. I look at China's actions in the South and East China Seas, and I agree that the question is a fair one. This week, the current contretemps between Hanoi and Beijing continues to smolder. China initiated it by moving a very large oil drilling rig close to islands that are the subject of dispute between Vietnam and China and lie within the former's exclusive economic zone. The Guardian reported a week ago, Thursday, that 21 people had died in the ensuing Vietnamese protests against China. Beijing evacuated 3,000 Chinese nationals. The incident is not over. On Tuesday, this week, a Vietnamese foreign ministry spokesman said that a Chinese boat had rammed and sunk a Vietnamese fishing vessel that was operating well within Vietnam's exclusive economic zone. What is China doing? China is conducting a two-part policy of incorporating the international waters of the South and East China Seas within its sovereign grasp. The first part is lawfare, the use of dubious legalisms to assert claims and to tighten Beijing's grip. For example, China in November of 2013 declared an air defense identification zone known as ADIZ in a large part of the East China Sea that includes Japan's Senkaku Islands, which China claims. While such zones are usually established, normally established for the control of civil aircraft, they customarily do not include disputed territory. China's ADIZ does. The second tine of the Chinese pitchfork is coercive. Today's dispute over the oil rig China placed in Vietnam's exclusive economic zone is deliberately aggressive, as is the swarm of Chinese naval and civilian craft that were sent to escort and surround the billion-dollar oil platform, drilling platform. The Obama administration's answer to increased tension between Japan and China over the Senkaku Islands was words. Secretary of Defense Hagel said that China's, quote, unilateral action increases the risk of misunderstanding and miscalculations, unquote. So, in fact, the right words were used. The riots in Vietnam and evacuation of Chinese nationals in the current incident do indeed indicate the large potential for miscalculation. Unfortunately, however, as I noted a moment ago, Hagel speaks for a cabinet department from whose budget it is his mission to wring every last dollar. In the world of power politics, to which we are returning after a short bout with ideological confrontation, words unbacked by actions do not impress. And because they are unimpressed, our adversaries act, from Tehran to Donetsk to the international waters of the South and the East China Seas. And thus, the President finds it necessary to impugn as partisan or uninformed those who ask whether America's global leadership is at risk. When the administration does more than talk, it heads for the courts. A week ago, the media reported on the U.S. Justice Department's indictments of Chinese nationals for hacking against American firms. The likelihood that those indicted who live in China will be turned over to American authorities is low. The similarity to previous administrations that treated terror as a purely criminal and thus legal issue is high. China's cyber attacks against the U.S. government and important commercial nodes are crimes indeed, but they are a form of the undeclared warfare conducted as part of the strategic competition between China and the United States that the former acknowledges and the latter denies. More effective than criminal indictments would be significantly increased American military presence in the Asia-Pacific. A U.S. shipbuilding budget that can actually achieve the Navy's 306-ship fleet goal would help convince both Asian allies and potential adversaries that our deeds follow our words and that we understand that the Obama administration's smart power without supporting hard power equals no power. Adding 2 aircraft carrier battle groups to the one that is now homeported in Asia would be a convincing demonstration of American resolution. So would an Allied purchase of the 2 large amphibious ships that France plans to sell to Russia. These large vessels that together with Crimea would give Russia control of the Black Sea, as well as dramatically shift the balance of power to our disadvantage in the Eastern Mediterranean, could be profitably divided between Australia and South Korea or even Vietnam. This would also strengthen allies, and it would help persuade Beijing that coercion will not achieve its objectives. An additional need is growing as a result of China's nearly 2,000 land-based theater ballistic missiles, whose reach includes our Pacific bases as well as regional allies. Along with these should be counted North Korea's arsenal, about half the size of China's, of also theater ballistic missiles that threaten not only our allies, but U.S. bases as distant as Alaska. The warning systems needed to detect attacks from this expanding and dangerous array, together with the United States missile defenses against it, need to be enlarged. The Pacific Command's announcement yesterday that a pair of long-distance surveillance drones will be deployed to a base in northern Japan to monitor North Korean nuclear and Chinese naval activity is a step in the right direction. Much more needs to be done. 2 challenges face U.S. strategy today: the jihadists and the possibility that rather than a new world order, we will see a return to the old world order, the one that flourished as warfare based on religion and individual monarchs' ambition cut Europe apart. So the Treaty of Westphalia in the middle of the 17th century, through it, was a successful effort. It was undertaken to respect borders and, by implication, religious difference. The search for the international order such as it exists today really began in the Treaty of It is viewed that international order is viewed with as much contempt by the jihadists as by China and Russia, except, of course, where they benefit. But principle does not exist where it is honored only when an individual or a state regards it in their interest. Successful U.S. strategy would acknowledge this. A rebalance to Asia cannot be at the expense of existing American interests in concluding the war with jihadism on our terms, or assuring the security of the Eastern Mediterranean, or our allies in Europe and Israel. And a rebalance to Asia cannot be effective unless it includes both the diplomatic, economic, and military instruments that our friends find as reassuring as our competitor will find persuasive. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to try to answer your questions.
Seth, thank you very much. I apologize for being late. Thank you for proceeding in my absence, and to all of you for being here. Let me ask a quick question, if I may. First, you alluded to the shipbuilding plans and budget of the Navy being inadequate even to meet the 306-ship Navy. What actually is it likely to leave us with as things stand now, and how deficient is it in terms of what you think are the needed capabilities? Particularly, as you mentioned, putting 3 aircraft carriers in the Pacific, the Western Pacific, given the inventory, that would seem to be unsustainable. But talk a little bit about what you see as the requirements, Seth.
Well, the Congressional Research Service and the Congressional Budget Office more or less agree that the shipbuilding budget, which hovers around $13 billion or so, 13 to 14, ought to be north of $18 billion for the 30 years that 306 ship fleet is aimed to produce, or at the end of which that 306 ship fleet is supposed to exist. So that's $3 billion a year out of a $14 billion budget is a sizable difference. What was the other part, Frank?
Sort of the sense of what's required in light of these various threats you've talked about.
Yeah. My sense of what's required is that we need a much larger fleet than 306 ships. That if we had something like 350, I mean, we are, you know, whatever. We're approaching the requirement as it exists today. What it may look like 10 years from now is hard to say, but if you sort of straight line everything that's happening in the world today, I think 350 is a reasonable number.
Okay. Dan?
I kind of get Japan's reaction.
Mike, please.
Dan Pollock from the Zionist Organization of America. I kind of get Japan's reaction to China's expansion, and I understand the Philippines are just hoping America will stand up for them, but I don't really get Vietnam. We don't have an agreement to help defend them. What are the balance of forces that could possibly make Vietnam's resistance to China's expansion work for them? And obviously they're willing to fight a superpower for years on end. They did to us, but they lost the last war they had with China in, what was it, 1978? 78? And do you know what the thinking is in Vietnam? I'm really confused by what they're hoping to have happen.
As things become more and more desperate, and they are becoming desperate, I think the Vietnamese, I know the Vietnamese are looking toward Russia. That prospect doesn't seem to be a terribly good one, given what's going on between Russia and China these days. I think that they would be open to a greater diplomatic effort by the United States. The administration is, I think the administration is aware of this. I think that a lot more could be done to bring the Vietnamese along. And that's one of the reasons why I suggested that if we could figure out some sort of a coalition purchase of those French amphibious ships, considering Vietnam as a recipient of one of them, or a lease for $1 a year or something like that, would be very helpful and would bring them along nicely.
George?
George Nicholson, you know, Admiral McRaven talks about we can surge forces, but we can't surge trust. And during the past few weeks, comments by Congressman McKeon, Congressman Thornberry, and everything else talks about this increasingly a lack of trust among our allies. Can they really depend on us anymore? McKeon 2 weeks ago made the, Thornberry 2 weeks ago made the comment about his concerns about NATO. What's the real relevance of NATO? If our allies up there in NATO won't stand up to support us with sanctions, what's happening in Ukraine, what value, going back to the American public and saying you need to spend additional billions and billions of dollars on our military when our allies aren't going to increase their budgets and are going to reduce their budgets? How do you justify that? And Congressman Adam Smith said, as much as a supporter as I am of the military, I go back to my district before I can even open my mouth, even though the large numbers of military units I've got in my area, Fort Lewis, McChord Air Force Base, they don't want to talk about problems of reducing the military force structure. They want to talk about Medicare. They want to talk about Social Security. They want to talk about their 401ks. How do you address that?
I can't address that. But if I were the President of the United States, I could address that. And if I were, I wouldn't announce here. So I think, I mean, that's an absolutely correct question. And the answer is that this is one of the things that a leader is supposed to do. You make the case, and then you persuade people, and you bring them along. Could the Civil War have been conducted without somebody as persuasive and as intellectually up to the arguments as Lincoln? I doubt it very much. I mean, look at the riots that took place in the Northeast. I mean, look at what a less responsible, less intelligent policy to the border states would have meant. They would have gone over to the South. So I think that the answer here is that this is where leadership is required. It's where explaining what's at stake, and what's at stake really is, as it has not been in the past, the future of NATO. I mean, if NATO buckles under here, or if the Russians try again somewhere else, like in the Balts, and the response is the same as it was in Ukraine, that's it. It's all over. So I think most people understand that. My guess is the President probably understands that too, but what's he doing about it?
I fear it's not just the future of NATO that's at stake. Admiral? Mike?
All right, Seth, I'll take those 2 extra ships. And I got to say, the one thing I don't agree with Hagel
one thing?
almost on anything, but there's one thing I do agree with him on. He is against the LCS ship. He sees its fallacy, and with work now as the Deputy Secretary, I think sparks are going to fly there. There's no question we should have the 350 ships. That, you know, we just magically lowering the numbers, and the program we have now, we can't get to 306. That's clear. But let me address a couple of your other what China's doing in the South China Sea and our basically non-response is just inviting more encroachment and lessening our credibility and not only weakening our allies, but the alliances we have. Now, what East Alliance would do, since we still have a mutual defense treaty with the Philippines, and to throw the gauntlet down in the South China Sea, Ace Alliance would conduct a major amphibious exercise with the Philippines on one of their islands, and to send the message, we're not going away. You've got to do something dramatic to change the equation the way it is now. And with regard to your carrier deployments, I couldn't agree more, but the resources, as Frank points out, are pretty skosh. But what you can do, and I've done this, I've taken a carrier, yanked it out after phase 2 of its workup, and covertly deployed it to the Western Pacific for an interim period of time. And we can do things, and you could do that today, which would send the message you're trying to send.
Covertly deployed a carrier?
Covertly deployed a carrier. You can do it.
Okay. Erin, we're going to finish up with you. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I used to live in Asia, China for almost a decade. So in the time that I was there, I observed that, one, everybody knew mainland China was going to do what she's doing now. That was predictable, I say, 15, 20 years ago. Secondly, the surrounding countries, all of the surrounding countries that border mainland China have historically always had a problem with mainland China and have had to accommodate because she's an 800-pound gorilla. Now with the current events, where is India, who has a long-standing border issue with mainland China, and all the surrounding countries? I mean, there is an effort. Someone must be, coordinating, because all of them together, or singularly, they cannot take on mainland China, but all of them together might be able to work something out. But where is India on this one? Thank you.
Well, this administration has been trying to work together with the countries you mentioned. Meetings in Singapore, Thailand, Malaysia, the turnaround in the policy toward Burma, all of that has been part of the diplomatic effort. And the Indians are, I don't think the Indians need to be any prodding to understand what the stakes are here and what they have to lose and so on and so forth. My concern is that those diplomatic and in some cases economic, strengthening those diplomatic and in some cases economic relations leave the security issue out of the picture mostly. I suppose most of you are aware of the unfortunate administration, the Defense Department official, I think her name is Katrina McFarland, who said when the administration's budget figures were released at the end of February that the pivot to Asia can't happen, and then later in the day said, "Oh, well, it's not really what I meant," but she said it. So that's what I'm concerned about. She's, she kind of knew what she was talking about, and
just wasn't supposed to talk about.
Right. And Frank, one of the questions you asked that I didn't answer because I forgot but remembered was where are we headed if things continue with the shipbuilding budget as it is right now? And I think we're headed towards a 200-ship fleet within less than 15 years.
That includes LCSs making up some block of that, or is that without those rowboats?
Admiral Lyons is correct that the Secretary of Defense has said, I want something more robust, more like he said, more like with the capabilities of a frigate. And so it remains to be seen whether Navy scuttles back to NAVC and says, well, do what you were doing before, but turn it up a little bit, or says, we want a real frigate here.